Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing The Endurance, Shackleton's legendary Antarctic expedition by Caroline Alexander. If you normally listen to these, this might be a harder one for you to follow today because I'm going to be showing a lot of photos. This has the famous photos of Frank Hurley in this wonderful book, one of my all-time favorites, in part because there's so many stories being captured inside of it. A story of exploration, bravery, endurance, brotherhood, people having to live together under difficult circumstances, a bit of the miraculous. All of these things are in there, and that's what makes it so worthwhile. Now, it doesn't look to be very big, as you can see. I think I want to say maybe a couple hundred pages. Yeah, 100 and 209 pages altogether with an index. But a lot of the size of this is related to the photography, and sometimes the photography needing to be bigger so that you can have a better appreciation for it. So if you don't know about the Endurance, that's too bad. But there's documentaries, there's films, there's this text, there's another text, there's South, which is written by Sir Ernest, and a lot of documentation is drawn from that in this text. And anytime other texts are written, they all cross-reference each other. The story's pretty clear now, and it's 2025, and there was recently an expedition that went, obviously an expedition of an expedition. There's a lot of meta going on there, but a deep sea exploration vehicle, I think, went in 2024 to find the remains of the Endurance, and the Endurance was still visible on the stern. So really interesting. But if you want to hear about it, there's plenty of places that will give you a lot more visual documentation than I can in this little review. But what I can do is just summarize for you quickly that Shackleton had been part of other expeditions, and his idea was to have one that would cross. And the boat gets stuck in the ice flows. Then normally, obviously, the ice coalesces during a certain time period, but they thought they would be able to get out. Instead, it gets trapped and at a certain point squeezed and broken into pieces. They salvage what they can. I want to say like 2 or 3 tons worth of supplies. They salvage from there, and they're trying to think, how are we going? Certainly, we can't complete the mission that we've been come down here for, but can we survive now? And so they figure out a way to take one of the rescue boats from the ship, and they get from there to Elephant Island, and then the survivors from there, almost all the men survived. In fact, I think all the men survived. And from there, a lifeboat went to South Georgia Island. And from South Georgia Island, the men had to do an overland trek to the station that was on the island, which was itself its own adventure journey. They were on very little food and water and provisions, and they were just struggling to survive. So they then get that. They try to bring some expeditions back to rescue the men on Elephant Island. Finally, a Chilean captain who was offered a great reward later on, and he turned it down. He just said, I was just doing my job, but he got great fame in Chile. But a Chilean ship comes and rescues everybody. And it's a remarkable story, really full of twists and turns, not in the way that, one day there was a storm and then this thing happened, but just the twists and turns of humans trying to be together and survive a great ordeal. And I think there's the famous passage advertising, for people who would like to join this expedition, and it was, not a lot of pay, possible death, and people still signed up for it. There's the sort of men of that time period. There's a very famous picture of Sir Ernest himself, the leader without whom this would not have been a rescue. And that's what's interesting is he becomes famous for a failed expedition because of the leadership he showed in rescuing his men. When Shackleton embarked upon his imperial trans-Antarctic expedition, he was already a national hero with 2 polar expeditions behind him, including one that had taken him to within 100 miles of the South Pole, the farthest south anyone had traveled at that time. Yet for all of the heroism of these earlier efforts, neither had accomplished what it had set out to do. By the time Shackleton headed south again in 1914, the prize of the South Pole, which he had twice sought, had been claimed by others. Undaunted, he had turned his sights upon a last great venture, the crossing of the Antarctic continent from the Weddell to the Ross Sea. The preparations for the Endurance expedition had been all-consuming, Not the least of Shackleton's tasks had been raising the funds to make it possible. He was 40 years of age, and he had summoned all his experience as explorer and organizer to bear on this ambitious undertaking. Shackleton could not yet know it, but the trans-Antarctic expedition would amount to another unsuccessful venture, yet ultimately it would be for this, the failed Endurance expedition, that he would be most remembered, and probably for which he got his knighthood. To give you some sense of South Georgia Island, I told you they had to cross it in order to get to a station from where they had landed. You can just see that. And as I say, I apologize, I don't have the editing and graphic resources to show you these pictures in a better way, but I promise you that the documentaries that are available will show them to you in an even more magnificent way. Here, again, are pictures of the Endurance in the ice. So here, it looks like an alien world walking out there. And it must have been to many of the men who'd never been down there. Shackleton had, of course, but here is what had happened when the ship had been caught in the ice, and you can see the listing of the ship due to the pressure that was being put on it. And over time, that's how the ship ended up breaking apart because of the pressure exerted on the hull. It just couldn't stand it. And the men were quite affected. They talked about they had lived in the ship and it had served them, and they referred to, I think, the screams of an animal dying, the pressures put on the wood and the sounds that were being made. And then when the ship did end up breaking apart, that's what it looked like. Just a big wreckage. But thankfully, the men were able to get enough provisions to help them survive until they got to Elephant Island, and then that was a very difficult time period while they were waiting for rescue there. You can see here's the first landing on Elephant Island. Not a lot of trees, not a lot of wildlife to help them survive. They had to fish, they had to find out ways to do that, they had to keep fires going. Here's another view of South Georgia Island. A desolate place. I have a great desire to go to Antarctica one day. I just got to figure out how to pay for it and when to go. But I won't go probably as far as they did, and I will probably have the protection of one of these cruises or one of these expeditions that go, but I want to see what they had a chance to see. Here they are on South Georgia Island trying to get to the finish line and get rescue. When men are as tired as we were, wrote Worsley, their nerves are on edge, and it is necessary for each man to take pains not to irritate the others. On this march we treated each other with a good deal more consideration than we should have done in normal circumstances. Never is etiquette and good form observed more carefully than by experienced travelers when they find themselves in a tight place. Great point. They had to do their best not to be irritated. Everyone was irritated. Everyone was cold. Everyone was hungry. Everyone wanted to give up, and they just kept pushing. And character is revealed in times of adversity. Love is revealed in times of adversity. It's not during the good times that you find out what a person is, or who a person is, or why a person is in a certain sense, but you find out in moments of adversity, and here these men reveal themselves to have an enormous amount of character. Shackleton finally gets to a point of rescue. Tell me, when was the war over? Shackleton had asked Sorla on arriving at Stromness Station after crossing South Georgia. So Shackleton thinks, well, of course, clearly the war must be over. And he says, the war is not over, Sorel had replied. Millions are being killed. Europe is mad. The world is mad. During their ordeal on the ice, the war had been a frequent topic of conversation, with the men chiefly concerned that they would miss it entirely by the time they got home. Before boarding the Yelko, Shackleton had taken pains to collect mail that had been waiting for the men at South Georgia, as well as newspapers, to give them some idea of what they had missed in the nearly 2 years they had been out of touch with the world. Opinions have changed on all sorts of subjects, Lees reports Shackleton is telling them on the Yelko. They call it the Roll of Honor now, instead of the casualty list. The reader may not realize quite how difficult it was for us to envisage nearly 2 years of the most stupendous war of history, wrote Shackleton in his own book, South. The locking of the armies in the trenches, the sinking of the Lusitania, the murder of Nurse Cavell, the use of poison gas and liquid fire, the submarine warfare, the Gallipoli campaign, the 100 other incidents of the war almost stunned us at first. I suppose our experience was unique, No other civilized men could have been as blankly ignorant of world-shaking happenings as we were when we reached Stromness whaling station. The war had changed everything, and most of all the heroic ideal. With millions of Europe's young men dead, Britain was not particularly interested in survival stories. The news of the Endurance expedition was so extraordinary that it could not fail to fill popular headlines, but Shackleton's official reception was markedly cool. Facetiously describing his arrival in Stanley in the Falklands after the failure of the Southern Sky rescue mission, the paper John Bull gave this account. Not a soul in Stanley seemed to care one scrap about his arrival. Not a single flag was flown. And old Kelper remarked, "'E ought to have been at the war long ago instead of messing about on icebergs." But of course, over time, that opinion shifted, and we have documentation such as this. Wonderful text by Caroline Alexander. I'll put a link in the description for you to buy a copy if you'd like one for yourself. I'll also see if I can find some links to some documentaries that I could recommend, and I'll try to put that in the description as well. If you'd like to support our channel, you can buy a copy. That's one of the ways that you can support our work. You can hit like or subscribe. It's a free way for you to support the channel. If you want to thank me for this presentation, there are links to buy me a coffee and PayPal below. If you want to support my work on an ongoing basis, there's links to Patreon and YouTube membership. When you do that, you'll get early access to videos like this one, as well as have the opportunities to ask me questions on monthly Q&As that I do for our paid members, subscribers. And if you'd like to buy a copy of a book that you'd like me to review, there's an Amazon wish list that's linked as well, and you can pick a book off of there, send it my way. You'll see different books from different categories there. You'll also see books on Palestine. That's for my Palestine bookshelf project if you're interested. But if you'd like to buy a copy, send it my way. I'll review it. And that's a way you can, in a way, sponsor a video. Until next time, enjoy your reading.